Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. The newly released national security strategy from Donald Trump is not really a strategy at all. It's a manifesto, an open-air declaration for permanent emergency rule, driven by aggression abroad and repression at home. It reads like something written by people who see governance as warfare and democracy as weakness. On the surface, it uses the familiar language of power politics, phrases like core national interests or strategic priorities. But once you read past the slogans, you find a message that's much darker. In Trump's vocabulary, core national interests means dismantling the post-World War II order that guided the free world for 80 years. The document makes no nod to the rules based on international systems that held rival powers in check and anchored peace. It replaces law with loyalty, alliance with obedience, and shared responsibility with unilateral authority. In its place comes a kind of bankrupt nationalism that treats long-standing allies, human rights, and institutions as disposable. When Trump talks about a nation's core, he really means its racial and cultural composition. That theme runs through every chapter and every line. Migration, ordinary human movement, is recast as a national security threat. Not poverty, not authoritarian expansion, not cyber warfare, or climate instability. No, the central threat in Trump's eyes is migrants, particularly from what he calls undesirable regions, the countries where black and brown people live. This is not hint or implication anymore, it's policy. The national security strategy turns campaign rhetoric, those poisonous lines about poisoned blood and invasions, into formal doctrine. Once that happens, white nationalism stops being a movement lurking at the edges of politics. It becomes law. When the regime writes something like this into official planning, it reshapes every lever of power that follows through our immigration system, defense spending, and diplomacy. This document is the clearest sign yet that Trump would govern not as a populist outside, but as an ethnic autocrat. One of the strangest sections presents what some analysts have already started calling the Trump corollary, a twisted remake of the Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century. The language is coded, but the meaning is unmistakable. The United States is to be the enforcer of the Western Hemisphere. Latin America is no longer pictured as a set of sovereign nations, but as a security zone under Washington's control, policed according to Trump's definition of law and order. There are no allies here, only subordinates. Every country becomes either obedient or suspect. The justifications are predictable: migration, drugs, China. But the structure this builds is dangerous. It authorizes intervention, even force, whenever Trump's regime decides a neighbor has violated a rule that he alone defines. It revives an imperial logic that Americans should have abandoned generations ago, and it does so with none of the moral disguise that earlier politicians used. This time there's no talk of freedom, only control. Domestically, the national security strategy stitches itself to Project 2025, the ideological blueprint drafted by Heritage Foundation lawyers and hard-right activists long before Trump took office again. Both projects share the same DNA. They erase diversity, equity, and inclusion from public life. They purge experts and career officials who know how to govern. They merge civilian oversight with political loyalty and resurrect a version of patronage politics that rewards ideology and punishes independence. The supposed counterterrorism sections are perhaps the clearest window into its motives. Instead of confronting right-wing militias or white nationalist terrorists, the people who actually commit political violence, the resources are redirected toward left-leaning extremist threats. That may sound obscure, but it's really code for protesters, journalists, labor organizers, and anyone who speaks out. Under this framework, public dissent becomes terrorism. Once that happens, the White House can treat peaceful demonstrations as security crises and deploy intelligence or law enforcement agents to silence them, or worse, the military. This is how an authoritarian state sustains itself, by redefining criticism as sedition. The strategy also tries to sell Trump again as the peace president. It claims to abandon forever wars and nation-building abroad. But only a few paragraphs later, it calls for a military so strong that no adversary or danger can ever threaten the United States. Taken literally, that's impossible. No country can eliminate every source of risk. Taken politically, it means permanent militarization. What Trump describes as peace is really dominance maintained through fear, Authoritarian leaders have always used that language. They promise peace, then define peace as everyone else's obedience. In this view, diplomacy is weakness, compromise is betrayal, and restraint is cowardice. It's an outlook that can turn any disagreement into war because the only acceptable status quo is supremacy. Trump insists he opposes endless wars, yet his policies guarantee them, a self-defeating loop of provocation that produces the instability he claims to prevent. He sells himself as a realist, but what he's offering is nihilism disguised as realism. Among the most disabling positions is the abandonment of NATO and the warm embrace of Vladimir Putin's Russia. Since 1949, NATO has been the backbone of transatlantic stability. It kept the peace through the Cold War, helped integrate Eastern Europe into democratic institutions, and served as a deterrent against aggression. Trump's new strategy calls that foundation obsolete and financially burdensome. It reframes NATO partners not as allies, but as freeloaders. And while he pushes them away, he gestures toward Moscow with remarkable deference. Hints in the document about territorial compromise in Eastern Europe are nothing less than a diplomatic green light to Putin. They signal a willingness to let Ukraine fail, to reward aggression under the banner of pragmatism. Replacing alliances with autocratic partnerships is not realism, it's surrender. It trades trust for transaction and replaces shared values with personal flattery. Once America abandons its allies, the moral center of the democratic world collapses. It's tempting to think this chaos is just the result of Trump's errant personality, his disinterest in policy, his obsession with loyalty. But the pattern runs deeper. What ties all of this together is the theory of power. In Trump's world, chaos is not a problem to fix. It's a tool to wield. Constant crisis justifies constant emergency measures. When people live in fear, they stop asking for rights and start begging for protection. If danger is perpetual, then extraordinary authority becomes normal. That's how the Free Republic morphs into a permanent state of exception. The war on migrants, the war on drugs, the war on protest, they all feed that cycle. By keeping the nation in a perpetual defensive crouch, the regime secures unlimited discretion. Everything abnormal becomes habitual. Everything temporary becomes permanent. Dictators have always known that fear makes the strongest foundation. It's also crucial to recognize that Trump didn't write this strategy. His attention span couldn't survive reading it, much less drafting it. These ideas come from the ideological machine surrounding him. The heritage lawyers, the Claremont essayists, the Federalist Society, judges who spent years dreaming of an executive unbound by constitutional restraint. The document is their wish list with Trump's signature as its weapon. They understand something fundamental about him. He craves loyalty but has no framework for policy. That makes him the perfect vessel for their ambitions. They can give him the language of strength and chaos that flatters his instincts, while turning those impulses into legal architecture. So although Trump appears to stumble into authoritarianism, the people behind him walk there deliberately. The national security strategy is the moment when their theories graduate from think tank white papers to governing doctrine. The domestic consequences are enormous. For ordinary Americans, this means living in a nation where the bounds of citizenship depend on loyalty. Immigrants are cast as permanent suspects. Government workers are purged for political reasons. Press freedom shrinks because inquiry itself becomes disloyalty. The environmentalist, the civil rights lawyer, the journalist, they all move under a new category, potential enemy. These policies train citizens to fear one another and to see compassion as weakness. Once that psychological shift takes hold, cruelty becomes easy to sell as justice. The regime doesn't have to convince everyone that its ideology is true. It just has to convince enough people that defending democracy is dangerous. When cruelty becomes a virtue, democracy erodes quietly. This redefinition of security changes how America relates to the world. Europe, long treated as the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, is now portrayed as an obstacle to American greatness. Nations built on pluralism and multilateralism are punished, while strongmen like Viktor Orban or Putin are praised as examples of sovereign strength. It's an astonishing reversal of historical roles. For 80 years, the U.S. was the anchor around which democracy is organized. Now it's the potential saboteur. If American leadership turns openly hostile, European democracies may have to form a coalition, not just without the United States, but to act against it. This isn't melodrama. It's what happens when the most powerful country in the world adopts authoritarian logic. The democratic world can no longer assume partnership as a given. It has to defend itself independently from the American government, even as its people remain allies in spirit. At the same time, this agenda reveals what may be called the inner logic of Trumpism: constant battle. It thrives only in opposition. The moment peace threatens to return, the moment normal governance seems possible, the entire movement weakens. That's why its policies manufacture conflict abroad and persecution at home. Without enemies, Trumpism has no identity. Its survival depends on convincing citizens that every institution is corrupted and every compromise fatal. From there, it can present one man's will as the only path to safety. What begins as populism ends as personal rule. That's the trajectory every autocratic movement has followed, from Mussolini's Italy to Orban's Hungary. The national security strategy translates that trajectory into American bureaucratic language. The humanitarian cost, if enacted, would be staggering. Imagine a border where every migrant is treated as a security threat rather than a human being. Families fleeing violence would be greeted by militarized checkpoints. Aid agencies could be criminalized for providing shelter. Surveillance technologies developed for battlefields would find new use tracking civilians. Freedoms that Americans take for granted, the right to protest, to assemble, to petition, would erode quietly, not through undramatic law, but through countless small regulations justified as security measures. In such a climate, the word terrorism loses its meaning. It becomes a label for anything the regime dislikes. Yet this program will not succeed automatically. History offers reasons for both fear and hope. Trump's earlier terms were marked by chaos. Yes, but also by resistance. Courts intervened, journalists exposed, citizens marched. Incompetence limited the damage, but that same incompetence cannot be relied upon again. The architects of Project 2025 have learned from their past failures. They now write detailed playbooks meant to bypass resistance entirely. That makes civic engagement, voting, organizing, defending institutions more crucial than ever. No one should comfort themselves with the belief that authoritarianism arrives only at gunpoint. Often it arrives through administrative memos, executive orders, and the slow normalization of fear. Still, there is power in collective refusal. Democratic societies have survived darkest hours by recognizing threats early and naming them plainly. That's why articulating what this national security strategy truly is, a manifesto, is essential. It's the first step toward countering it. Opposition cannot rest on nostalgia for a pre-Trump America. It must rebuild a forward vision of democracy strong enough to outlast this movement. That means defending immigration as a right, not a risk. It means treating journalism as an act of patriotism, not treason. It means understanding that international alliances are not burdens, but mirrors of our own values. Europe's role in this story matters too. The document all but dares democratic nations to distance themselves, and they must. Partnerships grounded in principle can survive a hostile administration only if they are rooted in shared convictions rather than personal loyalty. The European Union, Canada, Japan, and other democracies must continue reinforcing each other's institutions, because the underlying conflict here isn't just political, it's civilizational. It's between those who believe in plural democracy and those who would replace it with hierarchical nationalism. Trump's national security doctrine declares plainly which side he stands on. The rest of the world must be equally clear about which side it is on. For Americans, the response has to begin at home. Every movement toward autocracy counts as resignation, the quiet feeling that nothing you do matters. But every democratic renewal begins with the opposite conviction. It starts when ordinary people refuse to internalize fear. The courts, the press, civic groups, they are only as strong as the citizens who defend them. The next few years may test that resolve like never before. But the alternative, silence, is a choice that history never forgives. The national security strategy is not only a policy proposal, it's a loyalty test. It asks Americans to exchange liberty for safety, compassion for dominance. If we refuse, the strategy collapses. It has no power without obedience. So we cannot count on Trump's incompetence or on the decency of his administration's successors, or on the inertia of institutions to save us. The defense of democracy will not happen by accident. It will happen through deliberate action from voters, journalists, legislators, and allies abroad. The stakes are no longer abstract. This document envisions a nation that criminalizes empathy, that treats international cooperation as betrayal, that defines safety as permanent war. It's a chilling prospect, and yet naming it gives us direction. The first defense against authoritarianism is recognition. Trump's strategy might masquerade as policy, but in truth, it's an existential statement. America reimagined as fortress and empire, run by one man's will. It abandons reason or resentment, replaces law with impulse, and substitutes inclusion with hierarchy. It rewards the Orbáns and Putins of the world while punishing the democratic allies who stood beside us for generations. Fear becomes governance, policy becomes whim, and underneath it all runs a single unifying message: obedience is safety. That may be the message of the strategy, but it doesn't have to be the message of the people. Americans have faced down demagogues before, and democracy has outlasted them. But that endurance never came from passivity. It came from collective conscience and moral courage. Every generation has to reclaim the meaning of national security for itself. If Trump's version treats it as a weapon, then the task of the president is to redefine it as a promise. The security that comes from justice, from equality, from the rule of law, not from domination. The struggle begins by seeing this document for what it is, not just bad policy, but the enemy within, wrapped in the language of patriotism. Recognizing the truth is the beginning of resistance, and resistance at this moment is the highest form of patriotism. This has been America's Fractured Politics. If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe, share, and comment. Thank you for listening, and remember, keep up the fight. It takes all of us.